Hello there and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevicius. Today's guest is Dr. Kimberly Marshall, who is an organist, an organ scholar, holder of the Patricia and Leonard Goldman Endowed Professorship in Organ at Arizona State University. Dr. Marshall is celebrated worldwide for her compelling concerts, masterclasses, and lectures. She is a creative advocate for the King of Instruments in many different contexts. Her expertise in the earliest surviving organ music brought her worldwide renown. In today's amazing conversation, Dr. Marshall will share her insights about the earliest organ music created some 500, 600 and even almost 700 years ago. Let's go to the show. Dr. Marshall, I'm so delighted that we're having this conversation. I was kind of very hesitant to contact you. I know you are such an authority when it comes about to earliest organ music and its sources, but you so generously responded, and I was so lucky that we have this conversation finally is scheduled, and it works okay with the big time difference between Arizona and Vilnius. And I'm sure people from 89 countries will listen to our talk and will be inspired. Thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Well, it's my pleasure, Vidas. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Great. I usually start these interviews by asking guests about how they fell in love with the organ. But maybe it's great to jump right in about earliest organ music. How did you fall in love with the Renaissance and late medieval organ music too? That's a splendid story. Do you remember those days?
Oh, definitely. I remember them as if it was yesterday. I was a student at Oxford. I was working on my PhD degree, and I was doing research on the history of the organ. And as part of that, I was preparing a general history of organ repertoire. And I started investigating the early estampes, the motet intabulation, chanson intabulations, and I was just enchanted by this rather strange music. I have to say that one reason I got so involved with the early repertoire at that time was that my advisor, Christopher Page, had just created a group of singers called Gothic Voices, and they were starting to perform a lot of the vocal music with a very new philosophy where they were singing a cappella without instruments, and they were working very much on the tuning, so that they were tuning in an almost Pythagorean type of system, which is, of course, what the instruments would have been tuned in. And I was able to hear rehearsals of Gothic Voices in the very early days of the group. They've gone on to win many, many awards and make many recordings. But I remember sitting in the chapel at New College, Oxford, listening to them rehearse and just thinking, this is the most sublime sound. And fortunately, we organists have repertoire that is arrangements of these songs and motets. And so I was doubly inspired by having the chance to hear those marvelous singers.
Fantastic, Kimberly. I can even remember my own experience by playing from your book about late medieval organ music. I was sort of looking for the suitable repertoire to demonstrate organ sounds from various periods, and of course it started very early, even in ancient Greece, right?
Right.
But maybe this is another period too early for our conversation. But I came across to this magnificent source by Willy Appel, right?
Yes.
He published, edited probably the most important collections of earliest 14th century and 15th century organ music, and I I was enchanted by that too, and the temperaments, of course, Pythagorean. It was so new to my ears, right? And
Yeah.
still to this day I marvel how people are still interested. How come people are still interested in the music which was written, what, some 700 years ago, right? Isn't that spectacular?
Yes. It is really amazing. It shows the power of music notation because there are many wonderful traditions of music throughout the world, and some of them claim to go back 700 years.
Mm-hmm.
But we actually have several notated sources that give us information about how that music was performed exactly in such a different time period. And of course, I think human beings are generally fascinated with the past, with knowing where we've come from. Sometimes that's with a view towards feeling superior, that we've made all these great improvements. And I sometimes get that attitude in my own work. People think the medieval organ was very primitive, and so I need to play these pieces very, very slowly. And I get all sorts of different theories, but I really don't think that that's true. I believe much more in a cyclical approach towards music history, where different ideas get developed very, very fully, and then there's usually a reaction, a change of aesthetic, and therefore we move from the Renaissance to the Baroque, a very change of aesthetic, and on into the classical period. Again, the Baroque ideas were fully developed. They weren't inferior to what came later, just a different approach. And similarly, we have reports of keyboard players in the late medieval period being great virtuosi. I don't think that they were dealing with such primitive instruments that they couldn't impress their listeners, which is, of course, what we all try to do in every time period.
Fantastic. And to the general organ music enthusiast or student or organist in today's world, late medieval music is sort of very strange and even, let's say, foreign or exotic, right? When we talk about early music, of course, Johann Sebastian Bach comes to mind, right, as a pinnacle, and then what? Buxtehude, maybe, for the general person, right, who is not specialist, and then maybe Couperin, maybe a little bit of what else? Italians, right? Gabriele Frescobaldi, and then a mist, right? Like a fog shrouded on these vast landscapes of the organ, right? But you, luckily, being an expert in this, can reveal a little bit, take us into the world some 700 or 600 years ago. It was a very different world, right? Can you describe a little bit the context of the music which was created in those days? How was it different from today?
Well, it was very different in that it was primarily based on the intervals of the fourth and the fifth. And of course, in the 15th century, the interval of the third became much, much more important. That was referred to as the contenance angloise, the English consonants. And that really changed music, making it sound more major or minor. These are the tonal systems that, of course, have come down to the present day. But in the 14th and first half of the 15th century, certainly, the organ music is based much more on these open fifths, and it gives almost a Gregorian chant-like quality to the music. People think of it as kind of evoking the idea of Gothic cathedrals and a very, very open, hollow type of sound. And then when you put that third in it, within the fifth, it immediately becomes more of a major or minor sound. So you get the triad, the chords. But the music that I am specializing in is often just in two parts, with a slow-moving tenor line in the left hand and a more ornate, decorative treble line in the right hand. And this permits all sorts of different types of figuration. That's where you get the real virtuosity of the music. And certainly this is the case in the 14th century. And we have an Italian source from the early 15th century, from around 1430, that is also in this texture. This was found in the library in Faenza in Italy, and I believe you've played some of these pieces from the Faenza Codex. And they are also primarily in two voices with the slow-moving part. The Faenza Codex contains our earliest surviving liturgical music, where the plain song for the Mass is in long notes in the left hand, with this very decorative, freely composed upper voice that can have some very interesting rhythmic play against the left hand, some very ornate writing for the right hand. And then by the time we get to the middle of the 15th century, we're starting to get more three-part pieces that would sometimes have the third added, because that influence is starting to come in from England to the continent. So there's a vast variety, really, of music. And one thing that I find very interesting is that the three major collections of 14th and 15th century organ music all contain secular as well as more sacred-based music. So from the very outset, it seems that keyboard players were not just playing sacred music for the liturgy, but were also playing dance music, music based on popular songs, music that was arranged from the more secular aspects of life in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Fantastic! I can even imagine those dances, estampes being played and danced to in courts, right?
Of course,
they of course require different instruments than we have today. Probably, maybe organettos, maybe little small positives, right? Can you describe a little bit what kind of instrument is suited best for these earliest sources?
Well, it's actually difficult to generalize about that, because it seems that these sources may have been written down for practicing organists who were playing different types of instruments. So I don't think there's necessarily any one type of organ that works best for all of it. But I think you have to look at the individual works within it. You mentioned the estampi, and these are written down in two parts. So you need an instrument where the organist can play with both left and right hands. So I think that would have to be a small positive organ. By positive, what I mean is not an instrument that was carried, like not a portable organ, but an instrument that would be sitting, posed on a table, or perhaps even on the floor. And therefore, it would be pumped by someone else so that the organist would have both hands free to play. There's no way to play this music with an organetto, because you can't play it with one hand. However, it's also possible that they might have had someone else play another organetto playing the tenor. Who knows? I mean, it's very hard to tell. In that case, though, it would be difficult to explain why the notation is as a score. So both parts are written together as if for one person to play. So I think most of this music was probably played on small organs, small stationary organs. And we have surviving remnants from an organ in Sweden, actually on the island of Gotland.
Right.
A number of small organs were found. They've since been moved to the National History Museum in Stockholm. But they were found on this island that was off the southeast coast of Sweden, and a very important trading center. It was part of the Hanseatic League. And these instruments can tell us a little bit, perhaps, about the type of music or the type of organ that would be played. And they were what we call now blockwerks. That means to say that there were many rows of pipes at octave and fifth levels, but you couldn't separate them out. So they all played all the time. There was no stop separation on these instruments. And they also had pedals, but only about 7 or 8 pedals. And one thing that's very interesting is that the pedals seem to control 2 pipes at a time. So therefore, if you press one pedal, you would get 2 pipes sounding a fourth or a fifth apart, which relates to what I said earlier about the whole basis of the music being on those intervals. Mm-hmm. And so it seems that there might have been a tradition of improvising over this foundation of a kind of a drone of a fourth or fifth.
Oh, right. You're talking probably about the so-called preambulum, but they were called not preambulums at those days, but rather redeuntes, right?
Well, we have both. We have
right?
Both redeuntes and preambula, but you're right. There is a difference between them that's rather important. The redeuntes are based on drones. Mm-hmm. Like I just said, there's a sustained note, and even in the title, it will say redeuntes super C or super mi, meaning on C or on E, and they really feature the imagination of the organist, because over a drone one can do anything, right? So it's a real key to the type of music they were improvising. The preambula were pieces, well, there are two main sources for preambula in the 15th century. The earliest source we have is from 1448, the Illeborg tablature, right. And it contains 5 preambula, and some of these are based on drones for a while. They're very, very short pieces. They were clearly meant as intonations to prepare maybe singers for a certain pitch. And Illeborg even writes that each of them can be transposed to whatever pitch is needed. So that makes it very, very clear that they serve the function of an intonation. But the other source for preambula is the Buxheim Orgelbuch. And here we have really the first attempts at creating organ music without a pre-existing model. Mm-hmm. So there's no plain song, there's no secular chanson, there's no dance form. And it's very interesting because they aren't really based on drones. The redeuntes seem to be filling that purpose. And the preambula are written in such a way that they have different textures. And this seems to have been the way that late medieval organists created structure. So there'll be a section of just one line. Mm-hmm. And then you'll go into a section where maybe there's 3 voices playing chords for a while. So that's a homophonic texture. Mm-hmm. And then there might be a section where there's 2 parts in the treble and a more active voice in the left hand. So it's very interesting how these early preambula were put together. They can be even sort of guides for improvisation and showing the very earliest genesis of music for the organ.
Of course, the tablature of Adam Illeborg that you are referring to sounds still quite exotic to our ears because of these open fifths. But just a few years later, this Buxheimer Orgelbuch appears, and boom, we have this consonance anglois right here with 3 parts, right? What's the date, by the way, of Buxheimer's book? It's 1452, or?
It's not dated, and
not
that's
dated,
a bit of a problem. The Illeborg is dated at 1440. But we think that it's around 1455, something like that. But
still very, very close time span, right? Do you know whether the region where they were created is different from Adam Illeborg, or I know that it's not the North Germany, of course, Buxheimer. It's more of a different genre. South,
yes,
right? South.
Bavaria area, and it actually is now in the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. Yeah. It was found in Buxheim, which is the reason for the name, and Buxheim is in southern Germany. Mm-hmm. You're right; it's very interesting. It seems like suddenly Buxheim has more of the introduction of the third, and I think part of that is that Buxheim is a very, very large source. There are over 260 pieces in it. And the 9th fascicle of Buxheim was actually added later. So even though most of Buxheim is probably from around 1455 or something, we think that the last part of it was maybe added 5-10 years later. And it shows more development in that way. And for that section, it's fairly clear that the pedal is playing an octave lower than written.
Mm-hmm.
Buxheim is one of the first sources to indicate the use of pedal. The Illeborg tablature also indicates the use of pedal. So the Germans were very, very early at incorporating their feet in making music. But I think that not all of the Buxheim pieces do have the contenance angloise. It really is much more of a mixture of different styles, different degrees of sophistication as well. It's hard to know why it was compiled, because it seems like it maybe was a working copy. Mm-hmm. It's not a presentation copy. Mm-hmm. It's not written in beautiful calligraphy, as if to present for a donor or a patron. But it does have an incredible variety of music. Some of it very, like just two parts, not at all contemporary to what was going on at the time. But then some of it much, much more developed. We even have a piece, a Kyrie, a setting of the Kyrie from the Mass that is using the pedal consistently as a fourth voice. Mm-hmm. So, that is exceptional, but it's very forward-looking because, of course, once we get into the 16th century, four-part writing will become the norm for organ music.
So, in the 15th century, they had a different kind of notation, right? Completely foreign to our eyes, at least, right? And of course, scholars like yourself probably are at home with this day and night, probably. But still, for the majority of organists, it's very mysterious. Can you describe a little bit what those tablatures mean and the characters and how to read the rhythms as well? Please.
Yes, I'd be happy to. It's very interesting that you bring this up because there are several different notation systems. And that's also showing the lack of standardization at this time, but also the difference between national preferences for notating music. So our earliest source is the Robertsbridge Codex. And this was found in a register at Robertsbridge Abbey in England. It's only 2 pages of music, but they had been torn out of what was presumably a much larger music manuscript. And then the paper was reused because, of course, paper is valuable. You're not just going to throw it away or recycle it the way we do. They recycled it by using it in another book. And fortunately, someone realized, this is late medieval keyboard tablature. And they have since taken it out of that register, and now you can see it at the British Library. Now, the notation for that source is a version of what we call Old German organ tablature, where the top voice is written on a staff in staff notation. It's not like our modern notation, but it is written in symbols where you can see the pitch and the duration of time from the notation. But the left-hand part is written in letters, just like we might teach a child to play the keyboard. This is a C, this is a D, that sort of thing. But those letters are just written kind of underneath, right on the staff sometimes, right underneath the note to which presumably they correspond. So it's a little bit less clear exactly what the rhythmic notation of the left hand is in Robertsbridge Codex. But fortunately, I've benefited from a number of scholars who've seen it before, including Willy Appel, that you mentioned. And I did find one extra note that I think all the previous scholars missed. It's kind of in the margins, and I'm not sure if they were working for microfilm or what, but I was able to make that small, I think, improvement. Right. Yeah, so it's very interesting. Now, when we move into the 15th century, we get an important Italian source, the Faenza Codex that we referred to earlier, and this is written in staff notation on 2 staves. So it's just like we would expect today, except that the staves have more lines, and there's some little idiosyncrasies of the notation that we're not used to. But it's a score notation with two staves, and the right hand on one on the upper and the left hand on the lower in longer notes. Then when we get to Illeborg and Buxheim, we get to the classic version of Old German tablature. And this is basically, I guess, a development from what was used in the Robertsbridge Codex a century earlier. And in this case, the top voice is on a staff, and the bottom two voices are beneath the staff. So it's very, very clear. With Robertsbridge, it's sort of hard to read because those letters are just kind of crammed in under the treble notes. But with Buxheim, we have the lower voices written very, very clearly underneath, and they have rhythmic symbols to show us exactly what the rhythm of those voices is. So there's no question about how they correspond to the treble voice. Whereas in Robertsbridge, they were just kind of underneath the corresponding voice, and there is room for interpretation there. But with Buxheim, it is a much more sophisticated, evolved type of notation.
Right.
So you can see that we spend a lot of time just trying to get into the world. Each of these major sources has a completely different approach to notation, and presumably very different organ scene as well.
Because of course there was no uniform musical instruction, right? And everybody was apprenticing to some masters, right? And they have their own system. And today,
Yes.
of course, it's all universalized and unified, more or less in different countries similarly. And people learn only treble and bass clefs, right? But what
Right.
about other clefs? F clefs, 3 kinds of F clefs, 5 kinds of C clefs, right? And 2 kinds of G clefs. Is it worth today for today's organist learning at least some of them today?
That's a really good question, because I think some of it depends on the overriding musical tradition. You know, I've really witnessed this in my lifetime, because I remember growing up learning, you know, music by Buxtehude or Bach. Some of the C clefs were used much more frequently. And now all the additions are just putting everything into treble and bass clef. So they're sort of reflecting the lack of training in that area. But on the other hand, it's hard to say which comes first, the chicken or the egg, because I think musicians today have to learn so many things. I mean, to be versatile, I don't think we can necessarily compose string quartets using all those clefs, unless we're a composer, you know. And I think that so much is demanded of us that maybe it's fine not to spend a lot of time on those clefs, because, as you know, it takes a lot of time to develop organ playing and to be able to realize music. I mean, sometimes we're playing 4 or 5 parts of music using our hands and our feet. That's already a lot that it takes. And now we're expected to know everything from medieval music to jazz and to, you know, contemporary works and to multimedia and being able to have our podcasts and our Facebook pages. I mean, there's a lot going on right now. So I don't think spending a lot of time learning to read from those old clefs is that important, quite frankly.
From the practical perspective, I think, if I can say, my opinion is probably more practical if you are inclined to transpose, you know, because changing
Right.
clefs is very easy way to transpose music, but not many people are interested in transposing, of course. But for improvisers, that's essential, probably. For people who are eager to improvise, you know,
Right.
from the theme, and they only change the clefs and not the position of the notes on the staff, and that's very easy then. But you have to know other clefs too. But that's not majority
That's
of
a very
organist
good
programs.
point. Yeah, that's a very, very good point about transposition. And, you know, there are even instruments now. I mean, obviously, there's synthesizers where you can just change the pitch and do all kinds of interesting things. So I do think every organist really has to carve out their own journey through this amazing world of instruments and repertoire that we have. There's just no way that you can be an expert in everything. And you have to determine what you're interested in, what you want to contribute to the field, and then develop the techniques necessary. So, that might involve transposition, that might involve reading from a lot of clefs. In my case, that involved learning some very strange notation systems. But ultimately, my goal is to make this music accessible to people that basically know how to read treble and bass clefs and know how to read modern notation, because I'm happy to be the translator, if you will, and do that research just to get this music alive again. Because there's, as you know, music doesn't exist unless we make it sound again. And I've been very gratified by the response to my publications. People are playing this music all over the world now. And I do classes that try to inspire people and show them different ways that they might incorporate some late medieval music into their recital programs or into their liturgical playing.
It's fantastic. It's on the other hand, it amazes me how difficult life must have been in those days, which we are referring to, for example, in 14th century. Imagine blind organists like Francesco Landini, right, playing his organetto, being blind, right? How did he do that? How did he learn? Or Konrad Paumann, for example, also. Do you have a theory like that? How did they learn musical notation and playing of keyboard instruments in those days? Being blind, for example.
Well, I don't think they were doing notation themselves.
Right.
I mean, I think it was mainly students and other people trying to preserve the legacy or trying to expand the teaching. It's very interesting that you bring this up, because the first published organ music from 1512 was composed by another blind organist, Arnold Schlick. And you think, well, why would he even need to publish music, and how could he even prepare the publication? But he was very, very famous, and there was a real demand for this knowledge. So I think that there were always people around, students, disciples. You mentioned the apprentice system, people who wanted to, in some ways, document the work of these amazing musicians. And we're so lucky in the 21st century that they did this, because otherwise we would have no indication of what type of music they were playing or composing. I think that being a musician in those days was probably a very great way for a blind person to stay alive. I mean, I think part of it was just necessity, because if you think about it, it doesn't really matter if you can see if you're making amazing music, and your entire life really is happening in the sound world. Since you can't see, it's in some ways maybe a benefit for a musician, because you're just so focused on sound all the time. It's a legacy actually that came even into our own day. There were so many French organists that were blind, as you know, and even a school for blind young people in France. And I'm not sure if they were drawn to the organ because they were blind, or if it was because they were blind, they were great musicians, they were drawn to music, and then eventually made their way into the organ. But we have such a history. I'm even thinking now of Antonio de Cabezon was blind. Right. And that is some of the most important published music of the 16th century. But his son published the music, we know in that case. But in the case of Landini, the Florentine organist, or Konrad Paumann, we don't have the names of the people that notated their music. Prepared it. The Buxheim Orgelbuch, as you know, has Paumann's entire fundamentum or teaching method in there, which must have been notated by students or friends or maybe even family members. But we don't have that information.
Another point you bring up, Kimberly, is Arnold Schlick. Not only he wrote this beautiful Maria Zart, right, and
Yes.
This Ascendo ad Patrem Meum, which you so fantastically are playing too. We will talk about that just in a second. But he also was an author of the first organ builder treatise, right? Can you talk about a little bit Spiegel of this treatise? It's very fascinating.
Yeah, I'll speak about that with pleasure. I've been doing a lot of work on it. I prepared a recording of Schlick's entire body of organ music for the 500th anniversary of its publication in 2012. Mm-hmm. Amazing to think that 500 years later we can create the earliest published organ music. But you're right, the year before, in 1511, he published a treatise. He called it the Spiegel, meaning the mirror of information for organ builders and organists. And it contains much practical information about not only what type of sounds or stops you want to have on small and large organs, but also he even includes measurements for how wide the key should be, how high the bench should be. Very, very practical things in order to help make any new instrument useful and adaptable to making the best music possible. It's sort of written as a guide maybe to churches that were commissioning organs at that time, helping them to avoid certain pitfalls. One of my favorite lines from the Spiegel is when Schlick advises churches not to have too many sounds on the organ, too many stops. That he says there's a trend for having lots and lots and lots and lots of stops. But it's like having broth or soup that has way too much broth and not enough fish in it, because he's saying that you can have a lot of stops, but they don't have any distinctive sound. It's better to have a small instrument or a small number of stops, but each one of them speaks beautifully, than to have a fish stew with all broth and no fish.
Fantastic.
And I think that's great advice 500 years later, because we see so many churches wanting to have the biggest organ, the most number of stops. And sometimes you think they aren't even listening, because you can add stops and not even hear a difference on those. Right. It's just like having, a lot of broth and no content, right? So I love that advice from Schlick. I think it's still very timely.
And 1511, it's the day where when Blockwerk was fading away, probably, right? They were adding real organ stops to the systems, right? And his advice was, of course, very relevant.
Yes, well, that's very true. I mean, he documents the types of organs that he would recommend, and they are full of different types of stops. It's very, very different from the Blockwerk. Now, of course, he was in Heidelberg at the Palatinate court, so that was a very, I think, sophisticated area. The latest developments in organ building, etc. And that's one thing I always need to remember in doing my research, is that often what is documented is the most complex or the most developed for its time. And that doesn't mean that everywhere in Europe at that time there were places with organs like that, or places with organists capable of playing some of this more complicated music. So I'm always trying to remember that this might represent a very, very specific development, whereas it might not be representative of everything that's going on. And we find this also in the sources like Buchsheim Orgelbuch. I think that's a mixture of a lot of different things. Some of the music seems rather old-fashioned. Some of it seems very progressive. So always when looking back at historical documents or sources, I think it's important to remember this might not be representative. Just because it survived doesn't mean that it reflects large trends. It could be a very, very exceptional circumstance.
And this Maria Zart, fabulous three-part compositions that is written for both hands and feet, right? Isn't that a very wonderful trio? Very early trio, but so complete and even beautifully sounding even today, right?
Yes. Schlick wrote a number of trio and kind of quartet settings in the music that he published the year after Spiegel. He entitled that publication of music, Tablature of some sacred, actually it would be more secular and devotional songs. There's no liturgical music per se. It's mainly settings of songs such as the Maria Zart that would have been sung maybe in the home, maybe in the church as part of a service to the Virgin Mary, more devotional songs. And so he published this collection again. It's so interesting how the secular and sacred combine in almost all of these early collections of organ music. And he is using these textures that we've come to identify more with the Baroque, the trio. And he doesn't say exactly how they should be registered. So it's not always clear if you would be playing one hand on each manual and the lowest voice with the pedal. But that's certainly possible. I perform Maria Zart in many different contexts. It's possible to play it on one manual with the hands, or it's possible to play it like a Bach trio sonata. And I've done that also. It works beautifully in the pedal. We know that Schlick advocated a very fine use of pedal. He writes in the Spiegel that good organists should be able to play 2 and even 3 parts in the pedal so that they can make complete arrangements of vocal music. Vocal music was an important source for all organists, and often they would just be entabulating that, or basically playing all the vocal parts on the organ. And he writes that you need to be able to use the pedal, both feet, and even sometimes 2 parts in 1 foot, in order to be able to do that successfully. So that's requiring a very high standard of pedaling. And in some of the music that he published in his tablature, it benefits from using double pedal. But that is for the organist to decide. He does not give any indication of how to adapt the music to a specific instrument. So again, you can play the trios in different ways, separating out the voices with pedal sometimes or not, as you wish, or as it works best on the instrument. He also has solo lines in the right hand that are accompanied by 3 voices, 3 lower voices. So you could choose again. You might want to use double pedal for 2 of those voices, and then just the left hand for 1. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you realize the musical score. And of course, that's what makes organ playing so exciting and interesting. There's always something new and something to explore or discover.
Fantastic. And this, of course, leads us to the grand piece you performing, Ascendo ad Patrem Meum, right? Is it for what, 10 parts? 10 parts?
It is. It's in 10 voices in the second section. Yeah, this is very interesting because the piece was not part of Schlick's 1512 publication. This piece, we believe, was prompted by the visit of the Bishop of Trent to the Heidelberg court. And the Bishop of Trent was an elector for the Holy Roman Emperor. And we think that he was at the court for political reasons. And Schlick wanted to impress upon him what an important composer he was. And we think that Schlick wanted to play the organ for the coronation of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. And for this purpose, he composed Ascendo ad Patrem Meum. Now that is the plain song for coronations. Ascendo ad Patrem Meum, I ascend to my Father. is obviously a reference to Christ going back to be, with God the Father. And of course, in the same way, when the emperor is crowned, he becomes the representative of God on earth in this system. And so Schlick purposely chose that plain song, and then he wrote an amazing setting. It starts off only in two voices.
Right.
And then it explodes suddenly into the fullest setting one can imagine, 10 voices, which breaks down as 6 voices in the manuals in the hands and 4 voices in the feet, which means that you're almost always playing thirds in the feet. Obviously, you can't play anything farther than that because your feet might not reach. And I have to be very careful whenever I'm playing it that I'm wearing shoes where arch. Well, yeah, they don't have to be too high, but just high enough that the arch of my foot can be placed naturally where I don't want a note going on. If I play with really flat shoes, the shoe itself, even if my arch is kind of up, the shoe will press down. we get a cluster instead of a nice open third. But it's a very challenging piece to play. And some people have suggested it wasn't really meant for organ, and that it was meant more as a vocal piece, because Schlick also composed some vocal music that he sent to the Bishop of Trent with Ascendo. But the leading scholar of Schlick is Stephen Kyle. He actually was a colleague of mine when I was studying at Duke University, and he wrote his PhD dissertation on Schlick at Duke University. So we've remained friends and colleagues, and I was in constant contact with him when preparing my recording. And he says, no, it really is for organ. You can tell that partly by the spacing of the lower voices because they work perfectly for the feet. And not only that, there's no text underlay. I mean, because of the way it's notated, it wouldn't be clear how to put the syllables of the text into the piece. So I feel very vindicated by his expertise that this was intended as an organ piece. And, of course, Schlick would have hoped to be playing it himself at the coronation, which unfortunately did not happen. The very, very full texture in that 10-part section is probably Schlick's way of getting the absolute maximum out of the organ. And if you think about it, you would certainly want the absolute maximum tutti when playing for the Holy Roman Emperor to go down the nave. So I think it makes sense. I can't really comment on how winding systems of the time would have coped, because it is a very, very big drain on the wind, especially having those 4 parts in the pedal. But hopefully they would have had a lot of calcantin, a lot of bellows blowers for that occasion.
Now, Kimberly, a lot of people are very envious and very excited at this moment of our conversation, just waiting to find out where they can find this fabulous score of yours that you so graciously prepared, right? Can you lead us into maybe give us a link to your edition and to your website so that people can find your work online?
Oh, I would be delighted to do that. Both of my anthologies, Late Medieval Music and Renaissance Music, are published by Wayne Leopold. And that's Leopold Editions. I'll spell that. It's Leupold. And if you just do a search online for Leopold Editions, you'll be able to find them. And there's a Renaissance anthology and a Late Medieval anthology. And it's all my favorite works from those time periods. So a really good overview. I think it's very hard otherwise for organists to get into this music, because you have to have a research library and know where things are. And I think this is a really easy way. And then I've also written a lengthy introduction to both of those volumes, trying to give organists historical information as well as ideas for performance practice. So Wayne Leopold editions, both my Renaissance and late medieval anthologies are there. And then my website has all my recordings as well as the publications, and that is just Kimberly Marshall, KimberlyMarshall .com. So I would welcome any visitors to that site, and I also have a special Facebook page where I'm showing different things that I'm doing and what's going on in my professional life. Don't worry, it's not all my personal things. It's a professional Facebook page, and that's Kimberly Marshall Organist. So you do need to put organist because there's some other Kimberly Marshalls in the Facebook world doing some great things, but not the organ. So again, I'm at facebook.com, Kimberly Marshall Organist. And that's how you found me, right, Vidas?
Right. So fantastic. I feel that we could talk about these things for hours and hours, but of course you have to do some other fantastic things in your day, right, in Arizona. And but I do hope that people around the world will get inspired to listen to your music, to your recordings, and also to find out more about your publications also, because I can testify myself that these I own both of them, Renaissance and late medieval collections. Not only the scores themselves are very, very interesting, and you can play those types of music that were previously inaccessible, probably some of them at least, and but you also provide such a great way of information, is scholarly, but also you present it in such a user-friendly way that you don't have to be a Cambridge scholar, but you will understand, and you get a glimpse into your world as well. So thank you so much, Kimberly, for your such a generous sharing of ideas. I think it's so important in today's world to share things, right, that you know, and people will be inspired to follow your footsteps and maybe get a glimpse into the music that was created 5, 6, or even 700 years ago.
And bring it into our world today. That's my goal, and I really encourage everyone to try it out. Thanks so much for your interview. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and we'll stay in touch.
Fantastic. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog, Secrets of Organ Playing, at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice, and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Vidas Pinkevicius. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.